Well, it seems like the creatives over at Pixar Studios watched James Cameron's blockbuster Avatar movies and thought, you know what would make these stories even better? Beavers. Is Hoppers a fun animated twist on those sci-fi stories, or an uninspired dud from the popular animation studio? I have seen it, so let's talk about it. So, Hoppers is a story about characters transporting their human consciousness into robotic animal bodies in order to blend in and be accepted by the animal kingdom. And I'll be honest, in a way, that's kind of how I felt about the movie itself. To me, Hoppers feels like an animated movie that is trying to be a Pixar movie. I think the act is believable at times, but it just never feels fully at home in its own skin. I think it has all the outward elements of a classic Pixar film, but just lacks the soul. Rapidly paced and I think consistently entertaining, Hoppers has enough, wacky ideas and humor to satisfy young viewers, but I think there's a lack of emotional depth and a surprisingly dark tone at times keep it from reaching the loftier heights of prior Pixar stories. Now, fair or not, I think Pixar Studios is somewhat a victim of its own success. The studio's early stories were such rewatchable classics that really anything less than that standard feels like a bit of a letdown, and this film to me felt like a letdown. Hoppers is not, I think, a bad animated film, but I do think it is a subpar Pixar one. The film lacks some of the studio's usual, just imagination. The story's central concept is so familiar and reminiscent of films like Avatar that the movie itself even includes a meta joke where a frustrated character declares, "It's nothing like Avatar," and it just feels like a story that I've already seen plenty of times before in different forms. Now, Hoppers may not be a very original concept, but it is definitely at its best when pushing kind of that familiar idea to very amusing extremes. Because some scenes that were featured very heavily in the marketing material, such as animals kidnapping a human and using his phone to communicate, or a wild moment where a flock of seagulls lifts a giant shark out of the water and chases after the heroes in a car, are clear standouts. And I think just the wackier things get, the more Hoppers gains momentum. I think for any of its other shortcomings, Hoppers is rarely boring or dull, which to be honest is arguably the number one objective of an animated film. The film is really quickly paced, but perhaps even to a fault. Now, there is a very wholesome subplot between the main character and her grandma, which I personally found to be quite moving, but the film just doesn't really give these slower moments enough breathing room to make a bigger impression. The moments feel almost tacked on to check the emotional Pixar material box rather than feeling fully integrated into the main character's journey. Hoppers has energetic action and emotional drama, but I think it just lacks some storytelling sophistication to thread those elements together in a more cohesive way, as earlier Pixar films Up did, despite exploring similar themes of loss and grief. As far as the film's humor, I think its dry and kind of understated sense of humor will probably not work for everyone, but I personally found Hoppers to be quite funny, although more amusing than it is hilarious. That being said though, I should also say that I found both the humor and I think just the overall tone to be surprisingly dark at times. I think perhaps fitting for a story about beavers, this film has a bit more bite than I think some parents may expect or honestly may want. A lot of the humor here derives from violence, which, hey, the animal kingdom, it's a violent place. But such a scene where an insect queen is smushed mid-speech, and then you have the accidental murderer rub her gut-covered hands on the wall behind her. And I mean, it is funny, but obviously also pretty grim. In a similar way, the film also has some light sci-fi, almost horror vibes to it, because in a third act role reversal, an insect transports their consciousness into a human robot, and it's all a bit spooky and intense, as is a later scene where the artificial flesh is pulled away from the robot to reveal the robotic face underneath some sort of horrifying cartoonish Terminator. Now, my own sons are 11 years old and, so they were unbothered by it, but even they remarked afterwards that that was actually pretty creepy. And I think, to be clear, this is still very much a PG rated film, but just a PSA heads up that it's not all cute and cuddly beavers, and there is some potential nightmare fuel for younger or just more sensitive viewers. As far as content to consider, things going on the surface of it, really not a whole lot, although there are the odd thing to just make note of. For language, there's no profanity, but there are a few like crude words, like a character that says sucks, and you have a bird character that says the slogan flap around and find out, which is a clear play on like the more profane saying. For violence, nothing really here. Now there is some like violence done towards insects, such as the butterfly I mentioned earlier being squished, and another insect that is like eaten by a frog. There are also just like allusions to like the natural violence that occurs within the animal kingdom, with like animals eating each other, although it's never actually like depicted on screen. For sexuality, nothing that stood out to me or that I noticed. The only other kind of content thing is, which is consistent with a lot of these sort of animated films, is like the main character herself is like college age, so she's not like a child, but she does act in like rash ways that I think parents wouldn't always want their own child to do, such as like jumping in the middle of a like about to explode dynamite as a form of like nature preservation activism. As far as themes, worldview, things going on beneath the surface here, I think there are several kind of different thematic threads that weave really all throughout this story. I think the deepest and I think the most mature involves Mabel, who is the main character in this, and her like, relationship with her grandma as she's dealing with like the grief of her passing. And Mabel just struggles with a sense of like powerlessness to stop the world from changing and like moving forward. And I just think it is a powerful, if slightly like undeveloped theme in the film. But I think maybe like a more universally relatable message in the film for at least like younger audiences is sort of the standard animated movie theme about learning to like get along and coexist with others. And it's not a bad message for kids or their parents to be reminded of, but where I think Hoppers demonstrates some, I think maybe surprising maturity is in how it like elevates human dignity without diminishing like our sinful nature. In one scene, and just to like paraphrase it, a character remarks that everyone is good inside, to which a more cynical character responds, "You know that's not true." To which the first says, "But don't you wish that it was?" And it's a view of the world and I think human nature that is consistent with a biblical worldview. As Romans 3:23 tells us, people aren't good deep down. We're selfish, we're sinful, we're self-destructive creatures, and yet we are called to love each other as Jesus commands us in Mark 12:31. I think many animated films preach that, people should be kind and work well with others, but Hoppers felt just a bit more honest to me about the way that this, ideal simply isn't always easy. Because in the film, the animal characters have established pond rules to govern their like uneasy coexistence, and they may live together, but their needs sometimes conflict, such as predators needing to eat prey. And it's a good message that yes, the world is messy, painful, and like out of our control, and there is no perfect solution to like navigating this reality. Therefore, we must resist like our selfish tendencies and just be mindful of the needs of others, embracing a "we're all in this together" attitude, even when that requires personal sacrifice. So in the end, this movie, I think it's fine. There's certainly fun to be had with Hoppers, and both me and my kids enjoyed watching it. But even up until like the end credits rolled, it still felt like it was trying to win me over, and it just never fully succeeded. I think Hoppers is just a mixed bag. It's creative, but also leaves a lot of creative potential on the bone. It has heartfelt, emotional moments, but it never feels like an emotional journey. And it is a relatively wholesome film, but also one with a darker tone and sharper edge. It's a film that doesn't really contain any glaring problematic content to keep Christians away, other than perhaps just the slightly darker tone. But it's also a movie that doesn't really provide much to make it an enthusiastic recommendation. But hey, I would love to hear what you think. If you enjoyed this film maybe more than I did, or maybe you felt similar as me and my kids, don't be shy, jump into the comment section, let's have a conversation on it. If you haven't done so too, I encourage you guys, subscribe to the channel, become a collider. Got lots of other movie reviews, got our Faith and Pop Culture podcast, got interviews, just other fun stuff. Would love to have you guys be a part of that. But most of all, guys, thank you for watching, stay safe, and continue to collide with your world for Christ.